You wouldn't build a massive, magnificent house and, like, intentionally leave a jagged, gaping crack right down the middle of the concrete foundation.
Right. I mean, just to get the roof up faster.
Yeah.
Makes zero sense.
Exactly. But when you look at the architectural blueprint of American democracy back in 1776, well, that is exactly what happened.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate structural paradox.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we are diving deep into that 250-year-old paradox for you. We're exploring an incredibly fascinating piece of research called America and Civil Rights at 250. The long struggle for freedom, equality, and justice, 1776 to 2026.
And this work was authored by Professor Dr. Milton Biswas.
Yes, and it's a really crucial volume within this broader series. America at 250, a peace builder nation, the American journey at 250.
What makes this text so compelling, I think, is that we aren't just reciting a timeline here. When you read the analysis by Professor Dr. Milton Biswas, you realize he's investigating the actual mechanics of history.
Right, he's exploring the why.
Exactly why the glaring contradictions of America's founding made this, centuries-long conflict absolutely inevitable.
So let's look at that foundation. I mean, we all know the famous line from the Declaration of Independence, right? All men are created equal.
Sure, we learned it in grade school.
But right out of the gate, that promise explicitly excluded enslaved African Americans, indigenous peoples, and women.
And what's fascinating here is that exclusion wasn't just some accidental oversight.
No, it was highly calculated.
Very much so. If you look at the constitutional compromises of 1787, Professor Dr. Milton Biswas argues that the founders essentially prioritized the roof of national unity over the foundation of universal human rights.
But wait, if they intellectually understood that slavery contradicted their entire philosophy of liberty, why go out of their way to codify it into the supreme law of the land?
You mean with things like the Three-Fifths Compromise?
Yeah, exactly. Like, why actively write it into the framework?
Well, because the southern states held immense economic leverage. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas details how compromises like delaying the ban on the transatlantic slave trade until 1808 were just deemed necessary to get the South to join the Union.
And the Fugitive Slave Clause, right?
Exactly. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas emphasizes that these clauses legally bound free states to actively participate in the institution of slavery.
Well, wait, I'm going to drop the house metaphor for a bit, but, the point really remains. You just can't build a legal system on a deliberate contradiction without it eventually tearing itself apart.
You really can't.
Which brings us to the 19th century. Like, how do you hold a system like that together?
Well, the short answer is you don't. The economic incentives change drastically.
Oh, because of the cotton gin.
Right. With the invention of the cotton gin, the plantation economy just exploded. So the contradiction became a full-blown crisis. But, and this is important, Professor Dr. Milton Biswas is very careful to emphasize that this era wasn't just defined by oppression.
Right. It was defined by fierce, organized Black resistance, too.
Exactly. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas documents how figures like Frederick Douglass didn't just speak out. He used his own lived experience and his profound grasp of constitutional rhetoric to totally dismantle the legal justifications for slavery.
He was basically daring the nation to read its own founding document.
Yeah, which ultimately forces the eruption of the Civil War. And out of that horrific bloodshed, we get the Reconstruction era.
Right, the amendments. So, assuming you know the basics, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th established birthright citizenship, and the 15th secured voting rights for Black men.
And Professor Dr. Milton Biswas actually refers to this as a legal revolution.
Okay, let me stop you right there, because this is what always confuses me. If the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments legally fixed the foundation right after the Civil War, why does Professor Dr. Milton Biswas argue that this wasn't the end of the story?
It's a great point.
Like, why didn't the laws just fix the reality?
Well, it really comes down to the grim reality of enforcement versus culture. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas illustrates that a constitutional amendment is really just ink on paper if the judiciary actively refuses to enforce it.
Ah, so the Supreme Court stepped in.
Yeah, the court effectively neutered the 14th Amendment in its early rulings, and once federal troops withdrew from the South, local power structures violently reasserted themselves.
So they utilized, like, systemic disenfranchisement, poll taxes, literacy tests, outright terrorism.
Exactly. They used all of that to bypass the federal constitution entirely.
So the law changed, But the reality on the ground basically reverted.
Precisely. The rise of Jim Crow laws just built a new wall. And this harsh reality completely shifted the strategy of black leadership entering the 20th century.
Because you couldn't just rely on constitutional amendments anymore.
Right, which leads to a really fascinating ideological split.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Mm.
In the text, Professor Dr. Milton Biswas spends a lot of time analyzing Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes, two towering figures of the era.
And I've got to be honest, before reading this deep dive, I kind of always felt Booker T. Washington's approach was a bit of a letdown.
You mean his focus on vocational training and economic self-reliance?
Yeah, like navigating a hostile environment safely without demanding immediate political rights. It felt like, I don't know, a capitulation to white supremacy.
Yeah.
Especially when you contrast it with Du Bois aggressively demanding immediate political equality and founding the NAACP.
Well, that is definitely the conventional modern wisdom, but here is where the research of Professor Dr. Milton Biswas completely flips the script.
Oh, I loved this part.
He shows it wasn't capitulation at all, it was covert survival.
This was my absolute biggest aha moment in the book.
Right. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas reveals that while Washington publicly played the accommodationist to keep his institutions funded and his communities safe from racial terror, he was quietly, secretly funding the very legal challenges against segregation that Du Bois was championing.
It totally changes everything. He was building this economic war chest quietly, while Du Bois was fighting on the intellectual front lines with the talented 10th.
Exactly.
It makes me think of, like, a weather analogy. It's the difference between trying to survive a deadly storm versus trying to change the weather.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
Thanks. The research of Professor Dr. Milton Biswas makes it clear that Washington's strategy was a practical necessity for community survival. Like, you need a sturdy shelter first.
And Professor Dr. Milton Biswas frames their approaches not as these bitter opposites, but as indispensable complementary gears in a larger machine. Washington built the resilience, while Du Bois sharpened the legal weapons.
So how do those gears eventually force this system to break down in the mid-20th century?
Well, a major catalyst was the Second World War. You have millions of black Americans fighting fascism abroad, and then they returned to lynchings and segregation at home.
The Double V campaign, right?
Yes. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas notes this exposed the glaring hypocrisy of America trying to position itself as the leader of the free world. It made domestic segregation a huge geopolitical liability.
And that perfectly sets the stage for the fall of legal segregation, like Brown v. Board of Education in '54.
Overturning separate but equal, exactly.
Which leads right into the mass movements of the 50s and 60s.
Right.
We all know the story of Rosa Parks, but what I found fascinating is how Professor Dr. Milton Biswas highlights that the Montgomery bus boycott wasn't just, a spontaneous reaction.
Right. It wasn't just a tired woman refusing to give up her seat.
Exactly. It was a massive, highly coordinated economic strike.
Professor Dr. Milton Biswas details the immense logistics organized largely by black women over several months. I mean, they engineered an alternative transportation system for an entire city.
It wasn't just a moral plea. It was targeted economic leverage.
Precisely. And that sets the stage for Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC.
The way Professor Dr. Milton Biswas describes MLK's strategy of nonviolent resistance in places like Birmingham and Selma, it was essentially like holding a giant, unavoidable mirror up to society.
That's exactly what it was.
As Professor Dr. Milton Biswas describes the televised brutality in Birmingham, it forced the entire nation to look at its own ugly reflection. They couldn't look away anymore.
And that moral and economic pressure resulted in massive legislative triumphs. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
But, and this is key, Professor Dr. Milton Biswas makes a crucial distinction here. Integration and legal rights were really only half the battle.
Right, which is where Malcolm X becomes so vital to the narrative.
Because while MLK was dismantling legal segregation, Malcolm X recognized the deep psychological damage inflicted by centuries of white supremacy.
Correct. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas points out that Malcolm X argued for self-determination and black nationalism. He was deeply skeptical of assimilating into a society that fundamentally devalued black life.
He focused on global human rights as a counter-narrative to just domestic integration.
Yes, and according to Professor Dr. Milton Biswas, Malcolm X and MLK tackled two sides of the same coin. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas frames their differing approaches as pushing the nation to confront a harsh truth.
Which is?
That true freedom required both structural legal integration and deep psychological liberation.
Wow. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act passes. The legal architecture of Jim Crow is finally dismantled. But what is so incredible about this deep dive is how Professor Dr. Milton Biswas tracks the ripple effect of all this.
It's a massive ripple effect.
Yeah, the Black civil rights struggle essentially open-sourced a blueprint for liberation, and numerous other marginalized groups borrowed it.
Yes, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the core thesis of intersectionality that Professor Dr. Milton Biswas explores in America and Civil Rights at 250.
So what does this all mean for the listener today? How do these seemingly separate movements actually connect? Like, Professor Dr. Milton Biswas lists second-wave feminism fighting for workplace equality, the Native American push for tribal sovereignty with groups like AIM, Latino civil rights with Cesar Chavez, disability rights, LGBTQ activism. How do they mechanically connect?
Well, think about the legal vocabulary. For example, Professor Dr. Milton Biswas demonstrates how the disability rights movement, which culminated in the ADA, fundamentally shifted disability from a medical charity issue to a civil rights issue.
Oh, right. Because they use the exact legal framework of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Exactly. Specifically, the clauses regulating interstate commerce and equal access to public accommodations. They use those to demand that buildings and services be accessible to everyone.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It's the same with the American Indian movement, right?
Yes. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas outlines how Indigenous activists utilize the direct action media confrontation tactics seen in Birmingham to occupy Alcatraz and Wounded Knee.
They forced the federal government to publicly address centuries of broken treaties.
Exactly. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas's core thesis of intersectionality really shows how overcoming injustice in one area literally creates the legal and moral vocabulary to fight injustice everywhere.
It becomes a shared vocabulary of American liberation.
It does, but, you know, we have to remember the battlegrounds are constantly shifting.
Which brings us to the 21st century, the modern frontier. We move from physical lunch counters and buses to entirely invisible, complex battlegrounds.
Right, and reading the final chapters of the research by Professor Dr. Milton Biswas, we hit the post-9/11 era.
Yeah, he details this sudden, violent collision between the desperate quest for national security and fundamental civil liberties.
And Professor Dr. Milton Biswas explicitly highlights how that collision manifested in intense government surveillance and systemic Islamophobia. It cast Muslim Americans under a permanent shadow of suspicion.
It's that eternal American tension between security and liberty. And right alongside that, we enter the digital age.
Which is a profound double-edged sword. On one hand, Professor Dr. Milton Biswas seamlessly connects the long history of organizing to the decentralized activism of Black Lives Matter.
Because of social media, right?
Right. You didn't need a single charismatic leader anymore. Digital networks allowed citizens to instantly broadcast systemic police violence to the global consciousness.
But on the other hand, and I have to admit, I used to fall for this too. I used to believe the myth that the internet was the great equalizer. I thought data was just perfectly neutral.
Many people did.
But an algorithm isn't neutral. It's really just a digital mirror reflecting our past data.
That is a brilliant realization, and this raises an important question, one that aligns perfectly with a core warning from Professor Dr. Milton Biswas.
Who writes the code?
Exactly. We are facing the new frontier of artificial intelligence. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas warns about algorithmic bias and digital inequality.
Because if you train an AI system using data from a society steeped in 250 years of historical inequities,
the AI doesn't erase those biases, it replicates them, it automates them.
So Professor Dr. Milton Biswas warns us that if we aren't careful, AI will just automate the same biases we've been fighting for 250 years, but hide them behind math.
Exactly. Instead of a physical whites-only sign on a bank door, you just have a machine learning loan approval algorithm that quietly, instantly rejects applicants from specific zip codes.
And that is exactly why Professor Dr. Milton Biswas identifies digital data rights as the next massive civil rights battleground.
It really is. The historical prejudices are baked right into the tech governing modern life.
It's a terrifying thought, but it completely validates the overarching theme of this deep dive. The entire series, America at 250, A Peace Builder Nation, really drives this point home.
It does. Professor Dr. Milton Biswas's conclusion is that civil rights is not a closed chapter in a history book. It's not some static achievement we won in the 1960s and just put on a shelf.
No, it is an active, continuous, evolving pursuit demanding absolute vigilance.
And as the comprehensive research of Professor Dr. Milton Biswas proves, the ideals of 1776 were always just an aspiration. The true beauty of the American journey is the relentless courage of ordinary people who force the nation to live up to those aspirations, generation after generation.
Exactly. And, we are all active participants in writing the next chapter of this 250-year story.
We absolutely are.
So as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to bring back that foundation metaphor one last time and leave you with a thought to mull over on your own.
It's an important one.
If the beautiful, magnificent house of American democracy was built on a series of foundational compromises,
Yeah.
compromises about human life and liberty that required 250 years of relentless, grueling activism to untangle.
Right.
Looking at our world today, what silent foundational compromises are we currently making with global tech monopolies and invisible digital surveillance? And what massive, deeply entrenched structures will the activists for the next 250 years have to dismantle to truly secure our freedom?